Welcome to The Thriving Mama, the podcast that teaches you not just how to survive, but to thrive in motherhood. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Davis. When I was 35, I tested my hormones because I wanted to start preparing myself for getting pregnant with my first child. In general, I was feeling pretty good. I had, decent energy and sleep. My cycles were pretty good at the time, but I had a long history of really super painful, heavy, and long periods, which is why I ended up getting into functional medicine in the first place. When I got my hormone results back, I was horrified. All of my sex hormones, which are progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone, were in the tank. My hormone literally looked like one from a very postmenopausal woman. The likely contributors to that were stress from several cross-country moves. I opened up 2 practices with my husband. I had Epstein-Barr virus and Lyme that were in my system, but I did not know about them at the time. But most notably for me was long-term use hormonal birth control in the form of the pill and an IUD. At the time, I addressed it by working on my stress levels, my detoxification, my adrenals, nutrient levels, and diet, because as I mentioned, I didn't know that those hidden infections were there. There are many labels that medicine has come up for, this set of circumstances. But what I didn't know at the time was that you can start to have perimenopausal symptoms and hormone levels as early as your mid-30s. And that was probably a contributing factor too. And all of the, life components and environment were significantly contributing to it. And I also like to say that it's happening earlier and earlier for women because of the way our, life and environment are. I always say we're stressed and dirty. And when I say dirty, I'm thinking, environment, food, air, and water, not, our bodies per se. But all of these things lead to and can contribute to hormone imbalances. And hormones are a funny thing. When they're balanced and good, we ignore them and take them for granted, even though they're involved in hundreds of biochemical reactions and are responsible for everything from our energy levels, our mood and sleep, to our sex drive, our skin quality and our body composition. When they're imbalanced, we feel it significantly all the ways that we don't want to, which is why I'm excited to bring on my friend and women's health expert, Dr. Jessica Drummond. Today, we'll break down the main causes of hormone imbalances affecting women today, as well as conditions like endometriosis and PMDD, how the nervous system regulation sets the stage for hormone health, and strategies for balanced hormones. Dr. Jessica Drummond is the founder of Integrative Women's Health Institute, where she's dedicated 17 years to crafting evidence-driven, cutting-edge programs that empower practitioners to address the complexities of women's health. Her unique approach focuses on functional nutrition, lifestyle medicine, movement therapies, nervous system regulation, trauma, and mindset, the essential elements often overlooked in traditional healthcare. Want to chat and get more personalized support? I'm offering podcast listeners a free 20-minute Thriving Mama check-in where we'll evaluate your physical, mental, and emotional health and provide useful resources to help you on your journey. You'll find that link in the show notes. I'm so excited to have my friend Jessica Drummond here today because, as I mentioned in the intro, she is a women's hormone expert, and we need so many of those because women are facing so many challenges today. So welcome so much, Jessica.
Thanks so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad that you're here. So what I wanted to start off first discussing is kind of laying the groundwork. So let's talk about the basics, about the primary sex hormones in women during their reproductive years. So that, for the audience means until menopause. And what does hormone balance look like in those years?
Well, it's cyclical, right? So pre-puberty to early puberty happens somewhere around the ages of 8 to 12. We know those numbers are getting a bit younger due to environmental hormonal exposures or environmental chemicals that are mimicking estrogen, and the fact that our meat and dairy and things like that have additional amounts of estrogen added to them. So somewhere in the neighborhood of ages 8 to 12, puberty begins, and then there's the monthly menstrual cycle. So to be in balance doesn't necessarily mean to have your hormone levels exactly the same all the time, but it means that your estrogen is relatively lower and progesterone and testosterone in the beginning of the cycle. Day one of the cycle is day one of bleeding, and then they rise. Actually, all three of them rise to some extent, but progesterone lower in the first half of the cycle. And then at ovulation, estrogen hits its peak, as does testosterone. And then they both decline and progesterone hits its peak in the luteal phase, or the second half of the menstrual phase. The 4 phases of the menstrual cycle are the bleeding, which is, roughly days 1 to days 3 to 7. Somewhere around day 3 to 5, the estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone levels to some extent begin to increase. That sort of, second stage of the cycle finishes about halfway through the cycle at ovulation. And then the second half of the cycle, the luteal phase, is when progesterone peaks and estrogen, testosterone drop off to restart the cycle again the next roughly 28 days later. So it's normal for it to take even up to 10 to 12 years for that initial cycle to be established. And there are some things that we can do nutritionally to make that improved and more regular faster. And then the same thing is that will pretty much last, if everything is healthy, up until roughly between ages 35 and 45, when perimenopause will begin. And that's a 10 to 15 year decline on the other side. So it's sort of like puberty in reverse. And then at menopause, the definition of menopause is 1 year post having any menstrual period bleeding. And so that's just kind of a, standard in time. It's just arbitrary. But after that, it's very unlikely that someone would start menstrual cycling again on their own.
Right. Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the point of when, that perimenopausal range starts, because I think so many women are unaware of it. It's interesting because in the intro, said I measured, because I didn't have my kids until I was older. And so at 35, I was like, oh, I'm going to measure my hormones and check everything out. And I looked menopausal. My estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone were all in the menopausal range. And part of it was there's a lot of reasons. It was like, stress is a big one of them. But, I had the hidden infections that I didn't know about. And then I had been on birth control for a long time. And I had also had a hormonal IUD. And I'm sure, you and I both know that doesn't help your cause either.
Right. Well, because primarily one of the things about being on birth control, even as little as 3 months, hormonal oral contraception, is that one of the ways that works is by using a protein called sex hormone binding globulin to bind up most of the hormone that you produce on your own. So, that sex hormone binding globulin protein will then potentially, for the long term or even permanently, once you come off hormonal birth control, suppress your own. It's not that it totally suppresses the production of your hormones, but it binds it up. And so you can look, as you said, menopausal, or sometimes there are reasons where there's just some changes in the brain's like kicking off of those hormonal cycles that end up having you look like you're in very low menopausal levels. And those are the circumstances where we have a lot of nutrition and lifestyle medicine ways to kind of take people back from the brink of perimenopause to menopause when they're in their, 30s and early 40s.
Are you seeing, so in my practice, I have seen that window kind of get younger and younger more recently. Are you seeing that in your practice?
It's hard to say. I don't have probably a large enough sample size to say that my clients are having sort of perimenopausal symptoms younger. Also, I think we're actually looking at this earlier compared to what we used to, because one good thing about social media and podcasts like this is people are starting to recognize that it's part of the process to be in perimenopause in your 30s and early 40s, where I don't think anyone really thought of that before. Now, concurrently, though, I do think that women in earlier years, and this is something I have seen and have talked about colleagues about, like women of my mother's generation, like the baby boomers, and even my grandmother's generation before that, I believe that generally speaking, their menopauses or their perimenopauses were somewhat less symptomatic. I mean, you always heard about hot flashes, but it was more transient. The weight gain maybe wasn't as marked, as so dramatic. So it's not to say that these things didn't occur, the sleeplessness, things like that, but there seemed to be a generally less degree of severity, or that's just what women were like, oh, this sucks and we have to deal with it. And they didn't talk about it a lot. So that could be. So it is a little bit hard to say, but I was actually interviewing for my podcast a couple weeks ago, a colleague of mine who's an endometriosis surgeon. And we were both talking about how much sort of sicker we're seeing women with complex chronic illness in their 20s, 30s, early 40s. But both of us, our, theory on this is actually a little bit what you were talking about before. It's the environmental stressors that we're dealing with, heavy weights of chronic viral infections, chronic bacterial infections, stress. I mean, think about, my mother to this day, she barely has a cell phone, no one worked 24/7. We were outside more, like the day-to-day kind of, there was no glyphosate, our food was less toxic, our water was less toxic. There are certain regions of Europe where you see less of this, where a lot of these things are outlawed. So I do think it's happening earlier, but I think it's more of an environmental shift, if you will.
No, I agree 100%. That when patients ask me about that type of stuff, because not only am I seeing these like hormonal issues happening in younger and younger women, even teenagers now, some of the teenagers that I see in my practice, I'm just like, wow, with I'd say environmental effects on hormones is pretty significant. But I'm also seeing, like, when I first started practicing almost 2 decades ago, I barely saw kids in my practice. Now half of my practice is kids. And so much of it is that environmental contribution. And it's for like the allergic triad or autoimmunity. It's stuff like that, that has, there's a direct environmental impact on those conditions. And especially your hormones. Your hormones are so sensitive to environmental factors. And I think that is a huge, huge contributor. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's really important that we keep talking about it. And at least in North America, I think the contribution of that to a lot of our chronic conditions that we're seeing now is underestimated. I think, like you had mentioned, in Europe, they're taking it more seriously because they have outlawed, glyphosate in certain places. So many of the chemicals and food additives that are in our food supply and water supply. So that's pretty significant.
Really, I think, we talk a lot about the obesity crisis and people eating too much multi-processed foods and things like that. But, you and I probably have practices where most of the families are eating at least a generally whole foods diet. Like, they're not necessarily on a particularly tight, restrictive diet for a teenager, but they're eating whole, unprocessed foods. They're cooking at home primarily. And this is still a significant problem, metabolic issues, immune related issues, which, if I think of this as a hierarchy, I actually, in women who are under, say, 45. So women, girls between 8 and 45, if they're having hormone issues, I really don't even address hormones unless we have to, because if you clean up nervous system regulation, metabolic health and environmental toxic stress and immune health, the endocrine system, the hormones just balance them out. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg. They just go back to their normal cycling healthy rhythm. The problem is like all this digging we have to do underneath. So if you think about like, what would a healthy 20-year-old, teenager be doing, right? They would spend 60%, 80% of their time outside. They would be eating food that was relatively local, whole, unprocessed. They would be drinking water. But the problem is our water has forever chemicals in it. Even the clothes, like I have two one's 13 and one's 20. I have two daughters and they wear a lot of clothes with microplastics in them, like Lululemon and all of that. And I am doing my best to discourage that, but that's challenging, right? Because that's their social environment. And the thing that's really hard about teenagers and even girls in their young 20s is, and actually for everyone, one of the things I'm constantly saying to my students is, look, smokers with friends are healthier than non-smokers with no friends. So the problem is with the social pressures of being on the phone and wearing Lululemon and, maybe eating too much junk food or drinking too much alcohol when they get to college, it's challenging to unwind that lifestyle. You don't see as many. I'm in a fortunate, where I live is a little bit more fortunate in terms of kids being outside more often. Maybe you are in Colorado, but still compared to 50 years ago, the amount of outdoor time and then quite frankly, just the amount of chemicals in the water and food because they're in the soil, even if someone's eating a wonderful whole foods unprocessed diet, they're still their metabolism is being disrupted by the chemicals and the excessive exposure to devices, which is changing their brain.
That's a whole other topic. Yeah. It's interesting too. I'm glad you brought up like the social aspect because that's huge. I see it impact different generations. Like, cause I see kids through, way older adults too. And it's, like you said, a lot of, I would say older baby boomers, not so much on the phones. Younger baby boomers, it's interesting. I see them on their phones as much as I see like teenagers, teenagers and young teens. Like sometimes when I'm around some of them, I'm just like, hey, why don't you put down your phone and join the group? It's like, and these are like family members and friends. I'm just like, hey, we're all over here. Cause I have made it intentional in my life when I'm around people that I care about to keep my phone down. And, the only time I will keep it on is like if my kids are at school and I need to, be alerted to if I get a call or something like that. But I've been very intentional about that. And I feel like the devices are a huge part of it too. And like you mentioned, they're changing our brain chemistry and that impacts our hormones as well. There's so many contributing root causes. And I feel like you also touched on like the outdoors. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. I mean, I remember when I was little, my mom would kick us out during the summer. She'd be like, get out of the house. And she wouldn't let us back in until it was dinner time, so we got all of that. And it's, that and the community and the interconnectedness. I mean, it's definitely changed. And I feel like you said, that's like, we have to find the balance there of what is normal now versus, kind of what is healthy and trying to navigate that. Do you have any suggestions on, parents who are navigating that or moms who are trying to just, handle that in their household?
No, just kidding.
I get it. Yeah. I get it. Oh, I get it.
Yeah, I would say that, it is about kind of staying on top of this for yourself as a model. And it also sometimes is just saying like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go hiking today. We're going to go take a walk. I like my younger daughter, like she'll tell you, I hate walking, like she'll want me to drive her around the corner to her friend's house. I'll be like, just walk there. And But she was like, well, I want to dance and I want to do Pilates. And I'm like, okay, so we support that. And then I know that I can get her to walk. Like we could spend all day Saturday walking outside if we go to the city and, she's kind of window shopping, right? So I think there's this integration with what's fun for them. And in fact, one of my old mentors from a really long time ago, one of my first jobs in physical therapy and women's health, said to me, whenever your kids like pick some activities, like do them with them. And you have to kind of be led by the things they're interested in. And I think if we can integrate that, and my older daughter, now that she's in college, and this year she was a sophomore, and so she has her own apartment and she's going to be cooking, and, she'll cook healthy food, but in a way that like she likes. And I think, again, the less restrictive and the more encouraging about adding things that are good for them in a way that's fun. Like I said, I mean, Kate will walk 6 miles in New York City, but won't walk 1 block to her friend's house. If there's something to go to, and it doesn't always have to be like actual shopping. It can just be like in like a more social environment. So I think there's that. There's sort of knowing your kid's personality and how can you compromise, build on the things they like to do. Obviously this is true, I think, for parenting in general, just picking your battles, but also trying to set up the environment. And that's one of the things we've done. And not everybody has the financial resources to do this, but really kind of look around and see what the environment is that your kids are going to be surrounded by. Like, is the school kind of outdoorsy? Do kids, are there things that they do for fun that you can integrate some of the real basics of healthy lifestyle? Because while it's much harder than it was 50 years ago because of the environmental chemicals, we can do, we have the ability to support detoxification with sweating, with appropriate hydration, installing air and water filters in your home. That's good for everything. Advocating doing that in the schools. It'll also lower the viral load in case of anything from flu to COVID to, whatever. So the kids will get sick less in schools. Advocating for ventilation and just eating outside and picnics. And, I think there's so many benefits to simplifying the lifestyle, but then also making the environment as conducive to healthy living so they don't have to think about it. If you've added a water filter to your house and then you're encouraging, you get the, whatever as much as you can, not a water bottle that's going to leak chemicals, but like a glass or a stainless steel water bottle that, they're going to you get it with their name on it or whatever they want in that way, and encourage them to count the number of water bottles. I think that's where we can start this shift, but I think it's very difficult because of the environment that we're living in. So I have a lot of compassion for my clients and for their parents, for my teenage clients, because I do see, so I work with a lot of patients with endometriosis. So,
oh, that's awesome that you brought it up, because I was actually just going to bring that up because I'm seeing more and more of that, like PMDD and endometriosis and stuff like that. So,
yeah. So my subspecialty in addition to long COVID is endometriosis. And I've been working with patients with endometriosis for like 25 years now. And I don't actually see that has necessarily changed, because it actually is in some ways changed for the better. We do have more awareness. People are getting diagnosed. They're still often going through 12 years of misdiagnosis before actually being diagnosed, which is problematic. But the surgeries are much better. The treatments are somewhat better. And then more and more of the surgeons are advocating, recommending their clients see people like you and I to prepare for and recover from the surgery, in addition to having pelvic floor physical therapy. So functional nutrition is really valuable. And the same thing for PMDD. I think really when we think about endometriosis and PMDD, and to a similar extent, PCOS, really with all of these, there's often a lot of overlap. And with endometriosis, what I'm increasingly seeing with the chronic viral challenges we now have is, so endometriosis, we used to call this the terrible triplets. It would be endometriosis related pelvic pain, vulvodynia or vulvar pain on insertion and during intercourse or just with tampons or anything like that. And bladder pain syndrome or bladder symptoms like urgency, frequency, things like that. But now I'm seeing this new terrible triplets now that we have endometriosis plus post-viral syndromes very often. And again, this may have existed, but I don't think to the extent that we've seen it in the last 4 years. So the other thing is mast cell activation syndrome or some kind of histamine issue, lots of hives, rashes, slow digestion, migraine headaches, things like that. Hypermobility and dysautonomia. So hypermobility could be as severe as a form of Ehlers-Danlos, where someone is really hyperflexible in their joints and could be even hypermobile in their vascular system, or something that they just do better when they're strength training appropriately and they wear maybe compressive clothes or things like that. They're just not hyperstretching their joints. And then the third thing with that is dysautonomia, which I describe as a person's literally automatic functions, like the blood pressure moment to moment, the temperature regulation moment to moment, things like that is altered. So you feel like you're a manual creature. You're like a manual car and you've got to slow down how quickly you stand up and exercise laying down instead of standing up. Like Pilates is much better for these kinds of people than weighted squats, you know? So that constellation of 6 significant symptom presentations is a lot of what I'm seeing with endometriosis. And so just like with everything else, PMDD, you have more challenges with neuroinflammation specifically related to the metabolic dysregulation of PCOS or PMS. And so with all of these, we walk our clients through like a 7-step system. And the way we begin, and this is a little bit happening all at the same time. It's a system we make it look like a wheel because we have to address all these things at kind of the same time. But the foundation is nervous system regulation. And what that means is, you know, ideally, most of the time, humans are kind of just at peace. What's known as calm aliveness. You're feeling attentive. You know, we're sitting here joyfully having this conversation. My body's relaxed. My brain is relaxed. I'm able to focus. I'm able to remember. I don't have a lot of brain fog. You know, I'm not worried about anything. I'm just presently here talking to you. That's sort of like 5 on the scale. That's where we would like to be all the time or most of the time. Then if we go to 0 on the scale, we're stuck in this like freeze state, which could be adaptive if you were trapped in a car and you're waiting for the jaws of life after an accident or something like that. But most of the time, it keeps people in the direction of depressed or just feeling very stuck. Like they don't have a lot of power over their own lives. They can't take action consistently. They just feel like everything else is happening to them. They don't have much control. And it's a real sense of stuckness. And that's also can be fear, depression, anxiety. And the same thing on the other end of the spectrum at a 10, you get this kind of chronic fight or flight, overwhelm, exhaustion, wired and tired, you know, oh my gosh, I have 1,000 things on my plate and I am so panicked about it all rather than just being like, oh, well, I'll do this one and then I'll do this one and I'll do this one. And, you know, whatever. Like before this call, I got some kind of surprising news. We're supposed to go to a meeting that we thought was going to be virtual and it's like 3 states away. And we were like, we can't actually come to that. You know, we thought this is going to be virtual. And, you know, I could panic and be like, oh my gosh, oh my God. But there's no use in doing that. You're going to just wait. We're going to adapt. They're going to mail us whatever we need to do, or we'll get on Zoom or whatever. It's like there's a panicked reaction to anything or a frozen reaction. Like, oh no, I'm just not even going to open this email. I can't handle whatever they're going to say next, you know? And this physically makes us sick hormonally if we're in either of those things or bouncing between the two all the time, because the nervous system is then constantly telling the immune system that we're under attack. And so there's going to be more inflammation, more mast cell degranulation, more pain, more bladder spasm, more myofascial spasm, more restricted blood flow, less neural innovation to all the tissues that need that. So that's a really important thing to be able to learn. And I think of it as a skill set that under some kind of emotional stress, you have a practiced ability to regulate the immune system. And so we work a lot on that. And then second, so that's kind of like, and the other thing I do, because I teach a lot of professionals too, is we practice co-regulating with our clients, because a lot of the times they have no idea what that feels like to be in calm aliveness. Like they haven't been there in 25 years, right?
Right. Oh, exactly.
And I, again, don't blame them. Nobody ever teaches us this. This is not something you learn in kindergarten, although you should.
Right. And it's not something that we were modeled either. Most of us, just kind of given the nature of life, that's not something that, 90% of us were modeled. So it's like, yeah, it is something that, those mirror neurons do a lot of good work in when you're doing that, trying to co-regulate with people, because I end up doing the same in my practice quite frequently, just with the nervous system regulation and then the emotional and trauma work too. And that's a huge piece of the puzzle. I think, before we got on, we were talking a little bit about, where trauma can get stuck, especially for women. And it's usually, kind of in between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. That's a huge place for, trauma and emotions to be stored. And then that, it causes, I always like to describe it as a kind of quiet noise in the background. It's like those programs on your computer that are running continuously that you're not aware of.
Yeah, because it's also that can help you understand why it's so fatiguing.
Yep, exactly. Fatigue is it's funny you mentioned that too, because it's a symptom that I hear so much about. And I was going to ask you about that too, because I would say in general, in the women that I see in their like 30s to, I would say probably mid 50s, there's, I would say, a tie for the most annoying symptoms. That's what we call it the most annoying symptom award. And it would be, fatigue, sleep disruption, and I would say to a lesser extent, irritability. But yeah, those are some of the more common things that are people complaining about, aside from, some of the general hormone, like directly hormonal related issues. So when a woman presents to you with these, what are the first things that you're suggesting to help them reverse it?
In terms of fatigue and sleep issues?
Yeah, fatigue and sleep, yeah.
Well, if we continue sort of through the process for what I use for anything, one is that nervous system regulation, because of exactly what you said. If you're always bouncing back between fight and flight and freeze, or you're stuck in one, because of those trauma scripts, because of a lot of different reasons, there can be physical stressors as well, then you're going to be fatigued just because your body is trying to keep up. Like it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's just overtaxed. And so the second step, which I think is really important, is helping someone from the very beginning, especially if they've had a complex chronic illness for a while, or even if it's kind of new, but it's not going to be something we can just, snap our fingers and unwind in 3 months. Most of the people who I see, this is a couple of months to a couple of year process of health. And really for everyone, it's becoming a lifelong thing you have to attend to, if you will, And so for me, what's really important to help people, because we never really think about what health is, it's just like, I want to be healthy. I want to be energetic. I want to lose weight. I want to sleep well. But the more we can really define those things, I think it's so helpful, because there's this continuum of health, right? One end is death, but what is the other end, right? Because even Olympic athletes often age faster, they get sick more often, they have a lot of stress, so what is the peak of health? And I think that's just different for everyone. You know, for some people, it's being able to do certain physical activities. It's for other people being really relaxed and patient and peaceful with their families. You know, for others, it's being less reactive. For some, it's being able to do like check off a bucket list. For some, it's like getting a promotion. It's just highly variable. So usually when people go see a health professional, they're trying to like get away from a certain symptom. And I get that. Yeah, like run away. But the question is to where? And the clearer we are on that, the easier it is to stay kind of energized and engaged in the process. So then the next thing I want to do is really hear the client's story. And we take all the time we need for that because usually that gives us a ton of information about the right next step options. And then we collect some data if and when necessary, things like lab tests and wearable data and things like that. And then we can co-create together, myself and my clients, a plan. Because if you're someone who's, let's say, 32 years old and you have endometriosis and you have 5 or 6 other comorbidity issues, but your key peak desire is that you want to be able to finish graduate school and get a specific kind of job and move to a certain area that requires you to have to do a lot of walking commute or something like that. So let's say there's something specific like that. Then as we're living into that, we can be like being successful immediately. And also there's a really, really good book written by this guy named Alan Gaby called The Way Out, which I use a lot with chronic illness. Yeah. And it's a tricky book because it can make people feel like, oh my gosh, this person thinks my pain is just all in my head. But the reality is that all these symptoms of chronic illness, whether it's fatigue or tingling or itchiness or nausea or dizziness or pain somewhere, they change. They're more or less intense. They can move around the body. And that's a sign that those symptoms aren't like directly indicative of like a particular tissue damage, as if like you broke your leg or something and there's like a clear injury. It's that these more vague systems, the nervous system, the immune system, the endocrine system, the digestive system, these sort of like vague organ and vascular and things like systems that we have are out of whack, and they're trying to tell us, but the body can't, we don't have an ability to really pinpoint that very accurately. So we just get these like annoying symptoms. But by understanding that a lot of those symptoms are generated in the brain to give us this information that things are not right, but it's not a real clear, warning signal, then it can be like, okay, I got it. I understand that things are kind of off now. I'm going to underreact to the symptoms and stay really focused on the goal. Now, it doesn't mean that you push through pain. It doesn't mean you push through symptom exacerbation. It means that you give yourself some time. It could be just a few minutes. It could be a day. It could be a week. Just depends on, and kind of reset your system so that you can keep moving in the direction of your goal. And this is a little bit easier said than understood, but to give you an example. So as you know, Stephanie, I've had long COVID since December of 2020, so almost 4 years now. And in the very beginning, I had a lot of pain. Like my whole body was burning all the time. It was like being dipped in fire. And it was kind of internal. It was like my vessels. So there would be nights that woke me up. And so here's kind of one of those things, like how people model for you. So think about 2 moms, like toddlers. And one toddler is like perfectly dressed and she's got a little bow in her hair. And she goes to play with something on a playground and she falls down. And her mom like panics and she runs over. She's like, oh my God, are you okay? And the baby, who didn't even realize she had like fallen down, sees her mom panicking and she panics and she starts bawling. there's another baby right next to her who's wearing like ripped sweatpants from her 6-year-old sister. And her mom's like exhausted. She's sitting on the side drinking an iced tea, and she like falls off the monkey bars. And she's just like, well, I'm dirty. I can put another rip in these pants. You know, my knee kind of hurts, but she can barely feel it. And her mom is not even looking at her. You know, she's underreacting, right? So this mother is underreacting. She's not neglectful. The kid's fine, but you know, the mom is underreacting. So I always say to my patients, I had a mother who was an underreactor. She would never panic if like we got a C on a test, or if the car, like I one time drove my car into the back of the garage when I was 16.
Right. That's amazing to have a mom that's an underreactor in those situations.
Yeah. It's, you know, it's not, it is what it is. And I feel like if you take that perspective with your symptoms, so you hold that in one hand, the underreaction, and then the other hand, you're like, what is the definition of healthy for me? How can I be moving slightly away from this part and slightly towards this part? Because you can have a morning when you have chronic illness where you have an intense burning hand, and yet your energy is okay that day. And maybe you didn't get a great night's sleep, but you're kind of excited about what you're going to do that day. You have like something fun at work, or you're on vacation that day or whatever. So I think that's really the magic when it comes to healing complex chronic illness. And yes, there are 1,000 things we do in the interim to support the brain and the vascular system and the immune system and the endocrine system with nutrition and herbs and lowering that toxic load to the best of our ability, and detoxing by sweating things out and pooping things out and all of that, binding things up. So we can use supplement stacks and all of that. And that's all very valuable. But I think the most important thing when you're dealing with an illness that has like 6 comorbidities, and you've had it, you know, in endometriosis, and PMDD is probably the same. You've had it for 12 to 15 years before anyone even kind of helped you address it at all, other than maybe giving you birth control pills or something like that. That ability to have a practitioner sit with you and walk that balancing act between underreactivity, and it's okay. Sometimes you're going to overreact, and that's fine. And sometimes you're going to underreact when maybe you should have reacted a little more, and that's also going to be fine. Like your body will eventually tell you when it's time to really react.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's tricky, you know, no one's going to get that perfect. And the same thing with your vision, right? Your vision might change after you start leaning into it. Maybe you're like, I really thought I wanted to, you know, be the director of this program. And it's like, oh my gosh, I don't even really like this job. You could change that. You can change it. You know, I really thought I wanted to be married. Now I don't. Okay. You can change that. Like, life can, both of these things can shift. And I think as long as we're managing those things, we're keeping them at the center of the healing experience, then all of our other tools will work better.
I think that's such a significant point, and something I try to drive home to all of the people I work with as well, because I feel like so many people are coming from the place of reactivity. It's like you had mentioned earlier, it's more like life is happening to them rather than them taking agency and, you know, actively participating and trying to, you know, navigate and steer the direction of their life. And that's really, really important. And I think that, like you had mentioned, like the nervous system regulation, and then just like like you mentioned, like reacting, you know, I don't want to say appropriately, but just like not overreacting or underreacting. When I talk about balance and health with patients, we talk about being in the middle. And like being in the middle is usually a good place. Like earlier, you used the scale, like being around a 5. That's a good place to be most of the time, because when we get to 0 and when we get to 10 is when things start to happen and break down and we have issues.
Yeah, when the wheels fall off. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly.
And I think it is important to acknowledge that systemically, like in the world we currently live in, with the stress we're exposed to, how much news we're exposed to, the kind of chaoticness that's going on. Is that new? Is that not new? Do we just know more about it? It's hard to say. But it was interesting. I was talking to one of my patients with endo, and she was like a 19-year-old college student or 21-year-old college student, somewhere in that range. And it was during the time, right around the time when the Ukrainian war began a few years ago. And I said, the difference between what you're having to deal with right now and what I had to deal with at your age is that there was be almost no way that I would know about that unless I happened to see like the 5 p.m. news that night. It just wasn't on anywhere. Maybe I might read a news article about it once if I read like the New York Times that week or something, but you just wouldn't know about a lot of the things that were going on. And she was really shocked by that. She couldn't really understand it. So I think that we have to recognize that between financial stressors and work stressors and social media and media stressors and the chaoticness of the environment that, quite frankly, some of which is designed to keep people
exactly
stuck, that you can, it's not that we're saying that like you shouldn't be stressed or overwhelmed or in too much pain and like take agency. We get it. Like,
yeah, yep, 100%.
This has happened to you, not for you. I also kind of hate that when there's like life coaches being like, oh, this happened for you. I don't know. That cancer didn't happen for you,
Right.
Sucks.
Oh yeah, exactly. It does. Yeah.
That endo.
Let's be honest. Yes, it does. Yeah.
That sucks.
Exactly. Yep.
But I think the first part of that is like, that happened to you and that sucks. And it's happening to a lot of people in a lot of different ways. It's increasing, it's spreading, it's problematic, and it's not entirely or maybe even at all your fault. And for you to be able to heal as much as you can in the direction that you want to, unfortunately, you have to kind of be in the driver's seat of this. Hopefully with a team or a collaborator like Stephanie or myself, because doing it alone is hard. We were even talking about before when we started, like both of us have been practitioners for 20, 25 years, and we have to work with people to help optimize our own health. So that's important. And then once you're like, okay, I'm going to live as healthily as I can, given the resources and the team that I have, and I'm going to underreact sometime to my symptoms, and I'm going to stay really focused on what health means to me. And that might be moment to moment, day by day. It might not even be like a milestone. It might be like every morning I have this lovely morning routine that I enjoy, or every afternoon I take a walk with a friend, or every day I'm a little more present with my kids who I'm with all the time, or, whatever. And so I think living into that vision of your own health is what really makes this much more effective.
No, I agree. It's interesting. Like, yeah, that's awesome that you talk about the individuality of the vision of health. I think that is important because we talk about individuality so much in the approach to treatment, but we don't necessarily talk about it with regard to what health looks like for each individual person. So that's amazing. And also I think is a key component is walking your journey with other people. Increasingly, we are disconnected from other people. It's so many people are working from home, or they go to work and they go home and they don't interact with other human beings otherwise. And it's really affecting our health. But also, like, especially on the healing journey is hard. It's not easy. And like, whenever I try to take on healing myself or working on myself anymore, I get into trouble. So I have learned I need to work with other people. I need somebody else to hold that space for me and say, hey, look at it this way, instead of the 50,000 ideas that you have, kind of spiraling in your head, right? Just have somebody take that load off of you and, hold your hand and say, I've got you and we're going to do this together. I think that's like, it's so, so important. And the more we can, offer that to people, the better. I love what you're doing in your practice and with the Integrative Health Institute as well. So if people want to find you, where can they find you?
Integrative Women's Health Institute.com is our website. If they want to work with me as a client, then just go to the About section and there's like a link, work with Dr. Drummond. And then for professionals who want to learn more about how to integrate not just this perspective, but literally the nuts and bolts, like which supplements and which nutrition plans and which nervous system tools and trackers and labs and all of that. We offer courses for health coaches, health and wellness professionals through that same website, or they can follow our podcast at Integrative Women's Health Podcast. We're on Instagram at Integrative Women's Health.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jessica, just because you gave us so many amazing tips and education, in this interview. And because hormones can be so difficult for women, especially, to wrap their heads around and manage and just walk that journey. And all of this information will help make it that much easier. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Jessica. If you made it this far, I truly appreciate you. Remember, knowledge is just the beginning. Taking action is what truly sparks change. If you're overwhelmed and don't have enough energy to make it through the day, I invite you to book a free 20-minute coaching call with me. It's a no-obligation chat where we can discuss your health goals and how I might be able to help you achieve them. Visit the link in the episode description to book that call. Until next time, keep striving for wellness, and remember, you have the power to not just survive, but thrive in motherhood.